In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer walked into a boardroom at Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York. He was carrying a device the size of a toaster. It weighed about 8 pounds. It had no film. It had no chemicals. It captured images electronically and stored them on a cassette tape. He had just invented the world's first digital camera. The executives in the room looked at it carefully. They asked questions. They ran the numbers. And then they told him to put it away. The technology was real. The invention worked. But it threatened everything Kodak had built, and everything Kodak was still making money from. So they buried it. 27 years later, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented the future was destroyed by it. This is how that happened. To understand Kodak's collapse, you need to understand just how dominant Kodak once was. At its peak, Kodak controlled approximately 90% of the film market in the United States. 90%. It employed over 140,000 people worldwide. It was one of the most valuable companies on earth. A brand so embedded in American culture that taking a photograph was often called a Kodak moment. The company had been built over nearly a century by a man named George Eastman, who had a simple but revolutionary idea: make photography accessible to ordinary people. Before Eastman, photography was a complex, expensive, professional endeavor. Cameras were large. The process required chemicals and darkrooms and technical expertise. In 1888, Eastman introduced the first Kodak camera. It was preloaded with film for 100 photographs. When you finished the roll, you mailed the entire camera back to Kodak. They developed the photos, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and mailed everything back to you. The tagline was simple: you press the button, we do the rest. It worked. Millions of people who had never taken a photograph before suddenly could. Photography became a mass-market product, and Kodak became the company that owned it. By the mid-20th century, Kodak's business model was one of the most profitable in corporate history. The cameras themselves were often sold cheaply or at cost. The real money was in film, the rolls that every camera required, over and over, indefinitely. It was the razor and blade model before anyone called it that. Give away the razor, sell the blades forever. Film was Kodak's blade, and for decades, nobody else had one. The company poured its profits into research and development. It attracted some of the best engineers and scientists in the world. Its research labs in Rochester became one of the most innovative facilities in American industry. Which is exactly why, in 1975, a young engineer named Steve Sasson was able to build the world's first digital camera using parts he found around the lab. It took him about a year. The resulting image was black and white, roughly 100 pixels wide, and took 23 seconds to display on a television screen. It was crude. It was slow. It was unmistakably the future. Sasson presented it to Kodak management and asked a simple question: when do we develop this? The answer he received was more complicated. Management understood immediately what digital photography meant. If images could be captured electronically, there was no need for film, no need for processing, no need for the chemicals, the paper, the development labs, the distribution network that Kodak had spent a century building. Digital photography was not just a new product. It was a direct threat to every dollar Kodak currently made. So the technology was classified. Sasson was told to keep it quiet. The digital camera was locked away, and Kodak continued selling film. For a while, this decision looked rational. Film was still enormously profitable. Digital technology in 1975 was nowhere near ready for the mass market. Why spend billions disrupting your own most profitable product before you absolutely had to? This logic had a name. Clayton Christensen, a Harvard professor, would later call it the Innovators' Dilemma. The better you are at serving your current customers, the worse you become at adapting to the future ones. Kodak was about to become the most famous example of this theory.
And into the 90s, Kodak watched digital technology develop and kept choosing film. This wasn't entirely irrational. Kodak did invest in digital research. By the early 1990s, it had developed some of the most advanced digital camera technology in the world. It launched its own digital products. It filed hundreds of patents. But every time the choice came down to investing seriously in digital versus protecting the film business, film won. The reasons were always logical in the short term. Film was generating billions of dollars in profit every year. Digital cameras were expensive and produced inferior images. Consumers were still buying film by the hundreds of millions of rolls annually. Why kill the golden goose? The answer arrived in the late 1990s in the form of a Japanese company called Sony. Sony had no film business to protect. It had no golden goose. It had no 100-year legacy built around chemical photography. What it had was consumer electronics expertise and no reason not to go all in on digital. When Sony released the Mavica, one of the first commercially successful digital cameras, it changed the conversation entirely. Suddenly consumers could take photographs, see them immediately on a screen, and share them without ever visiting a photo lab. The film industry began its collapse almost immediately. Between 2000 and 2010, film sales declined by approximately 96%. Not 96% over a generation, 96% in a single decade. Kodak had seen it coming for 25 years and had chosen not to act. By 2001, Kodak was in crisis. Its stock price had fallen from a high of around $90 per share to under $30. Its workforce was being cut in waves. Factories that had employed thousands of people for decades were closing. The company brought in a new CEO, Antonio Perez, in 2003, tasked with navigating the transition to digital. What followed was one of the most painful corporate transformations in American history. Kodak did eventually build a digital business. It invested heavily in digital cameras, in photo printing, in commercial printing technology. It sold off divisions. It laid off tens of thousands of employees. It restructured its debt. But it was always chasing, never leading. The company that had invented digital photography was competing in a market defined by Sony, Canon, Nikon, and eventually, fatally, the smartphone. Because the smartphone didn't just change how people took photographs, it eliminated the camera entirely for most consumers. Why carry a separate camera when the device in your pocket took better photos than anything Kodak made? Kodak had no answer for that question. In January 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that had employed 140,000 people at its peak filed with fewer than 17,000 employees remaining. Its stock, once worth $90 per share, was worth less than 36 cents. The patents it had spent decades accumulating, many of them foundational to digital photography, were sold off to a consortium of technology companies for approximately $525 million. The irony was almost too much to absorb. The patents that digital photography was built on, many of them originated at Kodak's own research labs, were now owned by the companies that had replaced it.
So what actually killed Kodak? The easy answer is digital photography, but that answer is incomplete. Kodak wasn't destroyed by technology it didn't understand. It was destroyed by technology it understood perfectly and chose not to act on. 3 things determined the outcome. First, protect the existing business at all costs. In 1975, the rational response to Sassen's invention would have been a long-term transition plan. Instead, Kodak suppressed the technology and extended film for as long as possible. This gave competitors 25 years to develop digital expertise without Kodak in the race. Second, confuse investment with transformation. Kodak spent billions on digital research, but never committed fully. Investment is not the same as commitment. True transformation requires willingness to cannibalize your own most profitable product before someone else does. Kodak was never willing to do that. Third, misread the consumer. Kodak believed consumers wanted better prints. They built photo kiosks and home printers. But consumers wanted to share images instantly, the behavior that became Instagram and Facebook. Kodak built for the world it knew. The consumer moved to a world it never imagined. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 as a much smaller company. It employs a few thousand people today. Steve Sassen, the engineer who built the first digital camera in 1975, received the National Medal of Technology from President Obama in 2009. He had been right all along. The company just couldn't afford to listen. Every industry has a Kodak moment waiting to happen. The question is whether the people running the company will recognize it in time. If you found this useful, the next case is already waiting. Subscribe and you won't miss it.